Dr. Artiran, I've got a few questions about how the customs union with Turkey works. I should say that doesn't necessarily mean one negotiated with the UK would be exactly the same, but it's an existing example we can look at. Part of the reason for having such a customs union between Turkey and the EU is to facilitate easier trade between the two places. Can you tell us, as well as the customs rules, how much regulatory alignment does Turkey need to follow in terms of single market rules to help facilitate that trade as well?
Thank you very much. I think it really plays an important part of the trade relationship between Turkey and the European Union. At the beginning of the evidence, I had given a couple of provisions from the association agreements between Turkey and the European Union. There is one other one which is very important for the customs union decision, Article 54 of the decision 1/95, and it says the principle of harmonization, which means we need to regulate in a similar manner the product regulations, starting with the technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary standards. So that started already in 1963. And one thing that actually I wanted to add, for instance, that agreement, the first start of the Turkey-EU partnership was notified as an interim agreement. And I found some documents which were discussed in the GATT Working Party report, whereby both the European Union, at the time it was called European Communities, and Turkey actually told that their agreement in 1963 was an interim agreement. At the time, some GATT members had opposed to this agreement, saying that, well, you don't have a clear plan, we don't know how long this will last. But both the European Communities and Turkey took the stance that this was an interim agreement, which would then be coupled with an additional protocol in 1970, and which culminated in 1995 with the customs union decision. So the entire engine that we have, starting with that agreement in 1963, with the additional protocol in 70, and with the customs union, they all foresee a regulatory harmonization inside. And I think that facilitates trade between Turkey and the European Union. For instance, just think about the CE trademark, the CE logo. Once we see that, at the border, it will have, very easy access to the market. Whereas if you don't see that CE brand, if UK ever leaves the European Union and you no longer have the CE mark, then you will have some problems when you ship your products to Turkey. So all of this harmonization, actually the non-tariff barriers, is a good thing under the customs union. It's not only about tariffs, but actually non-tariff barriers are very effective and you can get rid of them, which I think is the most helpful part of that.
I would just add a couple of points to that, which is that, firstly, Turkey is, of course, an accession country to the EU as well, and there is some debate as to how much of the customs unit, the design of that originally, takes account of the fact that Turkey is an accession country. And particularly in view of the second point, so the EU, we hear so often, the EU says the single market is not divisible. Well, in the case of Turkey, it clearly was. Now, probably the EU would argue that that was because Turkey was on an accession track, and therefore it was envisaged that it would go towards full harmonisation. The point that I'm trying to make in all of this is it is not clear that the same thing will be on offer to the UK, though taking into account my precedent point earlier, it would be hard for the EU to say we're not going to do it, but there is a reason the EU could turn around and say that's different, Turkey was an accession country, you can't have this or this in terms of the regulatory side.
Okay. The point I'm trying to make clear is that we shouldn't just think about this in terms of duties and tariffs, but there is, in addition, if you're interested in frictionless trade or trade as frictionless as possible, whatever phrase you want to use, there are regulatory rules as well as those normal customs rules. So let me just try and probe this a bit more. If you think of a product, let's say a car, Turkey makes cars, that car made in Turkey has to abide by the same product standards as a car made in Germany or France or the UK. But when we think about the single market rules, there are the product standards in terms of, say, the emissions from the car or the safety standards and so on, the actual core to the product. And then there's a whole load of other single market rules around the working conditions in the factory, environmental standards and so on. Again, to Dr. Artiran, can you give us some kind of picture of when we talk about regulatory alignment, how much of that body of single market rules does Turkey have to follow, including, if you like, those social and environmental things, as well as the core product standards rules?
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I mean, we didn't have, for instance, let me start with the social and environmental standards. That wasn't covered in the Turkey-EU Customs Union and Association Agreement. Separate. But that, came later on. And when you look at the recent talks, well, I mean, unfortunately, the talks have been suspended for the modernization of Turkey-EU Customs Union, but it's on the table. So when we had prepared this report, this impact assessment report for the European Commission 3 years ago, in that report the European Commission was foreseeing that in the revamped negotiations, European Union would impose the environmental and social standards as well. As it stands, we don't have them, we don't apply it, but the single market today in the existing customs union, we have to align with the technical barriers, the trade regulations with sanitary and phytosanitary standard, everything which is about product safety. But the other things regarding environmental standards and product, the human rights standards, etc.
Labour market?
No, they are not allowed for the time being.
I would say if we're looking at this to inform our view on the future UK relationship, we do already have a customs union text that exists between the EU and the UK in the form of the all UK customs arrangements in the backstop. So we can see from that when it comes to an EU customs union with the UK, they would require these level playing field provisions. So it would go into environment, labour, social, but also things like I've just blanked on the word, when you pay businesses money to...
State aid.
State aid, sorry, yes, sorry. I just thought that would be front of mind. But yes, so we can see that within that customs union that is envisioned, in the event that we go into the all-UK customs union as part of the backstop, then those provisions would be included. And that tells me that if we were to actually negotiate a long-term customs union with the EU, those would be required. On the impact of alignment in the case of Turkey, we should say that whilst it has been asked to harmonise in these certain areas, whilst it can make authorisations that potentially other non-EU members, apart from Switzerland, struggle to do, this doesn't actually lead to less friction at the border.
Well, that's my next question. Yes. If I may move on to the border.
Yeah, perhaps just comment on that, because we already have, for instance, competition rules, state aid rules are covered in Turkey-EU Customs Union. Yes, we don't have labour standards, we don't have environmental standards, but competition rules was imposed already from the very beginning, and I think it worked very well in Turkey, because the competition authority was established in 1995, and it works very well, and the reports by the European Commission shows that there has been a discipline or an understanding of competition policies, so that is part of the existing customs union.
Could I just broaden this to what may happen with us as opposed to Turkey, because I'm not an expert on Turkey. But clearly, you're sort of driving at the idea that would the regulatory standards be maintained if we left the EU but we kept a customs union? Personally, I think that's a slightly separate problem or a slightly separate issue, depending on how you look at it. If you look at the political declaration now on the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the EU, there is quite a lot in there about regulatory alignment. It covers environmental, social, all sorts of regulations like that. And the rationalisation for it within the political declaration is to have a fair trade, fair competition. You don't have an unfair level, you have a level playing field. So I think one thing is to actually negotiate the customs union, if that's what was wanted. Personally, as you gather, I would not want that. And the second thing is, when we get to negotiating the future relationship, if we ever get beyond the withdrawal agreement, so to speak, what sort of regulatory alignment would be in there? I think they're two slightly different issues.
Okay,